I'm Rachel, 38 years old, and I still remember the exact moment my husband's 24-year-old daughter posted a video online accusing me of emotionally abusing her throughout her entire childhood. I found out the same way 500,000 strangers did, scrolling through my phone at 11 at night, watching her cry on camera, describing a woman I didn't recognize wearing my face. Before we continue, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you've ever been falsely accused by someone you loved and protected, hit that like button and subscribe. This story is for you. She controlled everything I ate. She isolated me from my friends. She made me feel like I was never good enough, every single day, for 12 years, Madison said into the camera, her voice trembling with practiced vulnerability, tears sliding perfectly down her cheeks. The video had already been shared 40,000 times by the time my husband, Gary, walked into our bedroom holding his phone, his face pale and rigid. "Is this true?" he asked me, not with concern, not with the benefit of 12 years of marriage behind it, but with the flat, accusing tone of a man who had already decided the answer before he finished the question. I stared at him, feeling the floor tilt beneath me. "Gary, you were there. You lived in that house. None of this happened." He didn't answer. He simply looked at his phone again, at the comments flooding in beneath his daughter's video. Strangers calling me a monster, a narcissist, a woman who should never have been allowed near a child. By morning, 3 of my closest friends had quietly unfollowed me online. By that afternoon, Gary had asked me to stay somewhere else, until things calmed down. I packed a bag with shaking hands while Gary stood in the doorway, unable to look at me directly, already choosing his daughter's version of our life over the 12 years of mine that he had apparently just decided to erase. They thought a tearful video and 40,000 strangers' outrage were enough to rewrite an entire decade of raising a child I had loved as fiercely as my own. What none of them knew, not Madison, not Gary, not the thousands of people leaving furious comments on a video they had no way of verifying, was that I had kept something for years, quietly out of habit rather than suspicion, a detailed journal documenting every difficult conversation, every doctor's appointment, every small victory and setback of raising Madison from the age of 12, verified independently, years earlier, by a licensed child psychologist who had worked with our family during a difficult custody transition. And in exactly 10 days, that journal was about to change everything Madison thought she had already won. I met Gary 14 years ago, 2 years after his first marriage ended, back when Madison was still a quiet, watchful 10-year-old who spoke to me only in careful, guarded sentences for the first several months we knew each other. I understood, even then, that I wasn't simply marrying a man. I was stepping into the life of a little girl who had already survived one significant loss, and I approached that responsibility with a caution I had carried with me my entire career as a school psychologist, long before I ever considered Gary as anything more than a colleague's brother I'd met at a work dinner. Gary's ex-wife, Diane, had left the family when Madison was 8, moving across the country for a relationship Gary rarely discussed in detail, leaving him to raise Madison largely alone for 2 difficult years before he and I met. By the time Madison and I began building our relationship, she had already developed a deep, understandable wariness toward the idea of anyone new stepping into her mother's absence, and I never once tried to rush past that wariness or demand a role she wasn't ready to offer me. For the first several years, I was careful, deliberate, patient in ways that occasionally frustrated Gary, who wanted our new family to feel resolved faster than a grieving child could reasonably be expected to allow. I never forced affection. I never pushed Madison to call me anything beyond my first name, despite Gary's occasional suggestions that it might be nice, eventually, if she considered something warmer. I let her set the pace entirely, believing, based on both my professional training and my own instincts, that trust built slowly was the only kind of trust that would ever hold. By the time Madison turned 14, Our relationship had deepened into something I genuinely treasured, built through years of quiet consistency rather than any single dramatic gesture. She began confiding in me about friendships, about school pressures, about the complicated grief she still carried around her mother's absence, conversations she rarely had with Gary, who often struggled to know how to respond to Madison's emotional needs in the same careful way I had been trained to navigate professionally. What I didn't fully understand at the time, what would only become clear to me many years later, was how deeply that dynamic quietly wounded Gary's own sense of his role as Madison's father, a wound he never once discussed openly with either of us, choosing instead to let it settle somewhere beneath the surface of our family, unaddressed and slowly hardening. Diane re-entered Madison's life periodically over the years, inconsistent visits and phone calls that always left Madison unsettled for days afterward. Patterns I documented carefully in a journal I began keeping shortly after Madison turned 12, initially simply as a professional habit carried over from my career, a way of tracking patterns that might help me support her more effectively during difficult stretches. I had no idea, sitting beside Madison at her college graduation 18 months ago, watching her hug me tightly and thank me, through tears, for never giving up on her, that the very version of our relationship she was celebrating that day was about to be rewritten entirely, transformed into something unrecognizable the moment Madison found herself in a financial crisis, desperate enough to make an entirely different kind of story feel necessary. 6 months before the video appeared online, Madison called me late one night, her voice tight with an anxiety she rarely let show. She had taken out significant loans to launch a small wellness brand with a business partner she'd met through social media, an investment that had collapsed within a year, leaving her with debts far beyond what her entry-level marketing salary could reasonably cover. I offered, without hesitation, to help her figure out a repayment plan, the same way I had helped her navigate every financial and emotional crisis since she was 14 years old. I didn't know during that call that Madison's business partner, a woman named Kayla who had built a modest but growing following as a trauma awareness content creator, had already begun suggesting a very different kind of solution to Madison's financial troubles, one that had nothing to do with repayment plans and everything to do with the particular currency of viral sympathy. What I would only learn much later, piecing together timelines from screenshots Gary reluctantly showed me after everything unraveled, was that Kayla had specifically encouraged Madison to consider sharing her story publicly, framing the suggestion not as manipulation, but as healing, insisting that audiences responded generously, both emotionally and financially, to stories of childhood mistreatment overcome. Kayla had built her own modest career around exactly that kind of content, and she recognized in Madison's financial desperation an opportunity dressed convincingly as therapeutic encouragement. I never knew, sitting across from Madison at what I believed was simply another difficult but ordinary family dinner 3 months before the video, that she had already begun drafting the outline of a story that recast 12 years of careful, patient stepmothering into a narrative of control and isolation, borrowing language she had absorbed from months of consuming online content about narcissistic parenting, reshaping memories I recognized instantly, but couldn't have imagined being reframed so completely. Gary, meanwhile, had grown increasingly distant over those same months, though I attributed it, mistakenly, to stress at his own job rather than anything connected to Madison. What I didn't know was that Madison had begun speaking to her father privately during that period, carefully testing certain memories, certain phrases, gauging his reactions before ever committing anything to video, refining her account based on which details seemed to land most convincingly with him. By the time the video finally appeared online, it wasn't a spontaneous outpouring of long-buried pain. It was the product of months of careful rehearsal, informed by a business partner who understood exactly how viral sympathy translated into subscriber counts and eventual sponsorship deals, timed deliberately to launch alongside a modest crowdfunding campaign Kayla had already set up under the caption, "Help Madison heal and rebuild after years of hidden abuse." Standing in our bedroom that first night, watching Gary's face as he scrolled through comments from strangers who had already decided, within hours, that I was a monster, I didn't yet understand the full mechanics of what had been constructed against me. All I understood was that a girl I had raised with 12 years of patient, deliberate care had just handed her father a story neither of us recognized, and that Gary, without a single moment's hesitation, had chosen to believe it. My sister answered her phone before the first ring finished, her voice sharp with alarm the moment she heard mine. "Rachel, don't respond to anything online, not one comment. Come stay with me tonight." I didn't know yet how much that single piece of advice would end up protecting me. My sister, Elena, spread a stack of printed comments across her kitchen table the next morning, along with her laptop still open to Madison's video, paused mid-frame on a tearful close-up that had already accumulated over 200,000 views overnight. Elena had spent 15 years working as a family law paralegal, the kind of person who instinctively recognized the difference between raw emotional testimony and something more deliberately constructed. "Something about the pacing of this feels off," she said, scrubbing back through the video slowly. "Watch her hands. Watch how she pauses right before each specific accusation, almost like she's hitting marked beats." She paused the video again. "This isn't necessarily pain, Rachel. But it's definitely rehearsed pain." I sat across from her, exhausted and hollowed out from a sleepless night, unable yet to think clearly enough to analyze anything with Elena's professional detachment. "It doesn't matter if it's rehearsed. Gary believes it. 500,000 strangers believe it." "It matters enormously," Elena said, "because rehearsed testimony usually means there's a strategy behind it, and strategies leave evidence." She turned her laptop toward me, pulling up Madison's crowdfunding page, already showing over $11,000 raised within 18 hours. "This is coordinated, Rachel. Look at the timeline. The fundraiser went live within 20 minutes of the video posting. That's not spontaneous." Over the following days, Elena helped me approach the situation with a discipline I couldn't have managed alone. She encouraged me to say absolutely nothing publicly, resisting every instinct I had to defend myself directly to the strangers filling my inbox with insults, understanding, from years of watching contested custody and family disputes unfold, that public emotional responses rarely helped and often made things dramatically worse. Instead, Elena helped me quietly reach out to Dr. Patricia Nwusu, the licensed child psychologist who had worked with our family during a difficult period when Madison was 15, following a particularly hard stretch after one of Diane's inconsistent reappearances in her life. Dr. Nwusu had spent nearly a year meeting regularly with Madison during that time, documenting careful clinical notes about our family dynamic as part of Madison's therapeutic care. Dr. Nwusu responded to my message within hours, her tone immediately, unmistakably concerned. "Rachel, I've been following this story since a former colleague sent it to me last night. I want to be very clear, nothing in what Madison is describing matches anything I documented during our sessions together. If you need my professional records released to support you, I'll need Madison's or a court's authorization, but I want you to know I'm prepared to speak to the discrepancy, professionally and carefully, if this situation requires it." I sat with that message for a long time, feeling something steady itself inside me for the first time since the video appeared. I had kept my own journal faithfully for years, an old professional habit, rather than any anticipation of needing it as evidence, documenting appointments, difficult conversations, and small, ordinary moments of raising a teenager through grief and uncertainty. Elena, reading through several years of entries with me that evening, grew quieter and more focused with every page. "This isn't just defense, Rachel," she said finally, closing the most recent notebook carefully. This is a nearly complete, contemporaneously documented record contradicting almost everything in that video, point by point, dated years before any of this became necessary. She looked up at me. We need to talk to a lawyer, today. Chapter 2, Part 2. Elena connected me with a defamation attorney she'd worked alongside years earlier, a measured, sharp-eyed woman named Fatima Bello, who specialized specifically in online harassment and reputational harm cases. Fatima reviewed my journals, Dr. Nwusu's message, and the timeline Elena had assembled with the same unhurried thoroughness I would come to recognize as her defining quality over the following days. This is one of the more clearly documented cases I've reviewed in years, Fatima said during our first meeting, sliding a legal pad out across her desk covered in careful notes. But before we discuss any legal response, I want to understand the financial angle here. Walk me through this crowdfunding campaign again. I explained what Elena and I had already pieced together, the timing of the fundraiser, its immediate launch alongside the video, the involvement of Madison's business partner, Kayla, who had built her own online following around exactly this kind of emotionally charged content. Fatima listened carefully, occasionally jotting notes, her expression sharpening with each new detail. I want my research team to look into Kayla's history, Fatima said. If this is part of a broader pattern, rather than an isolated incident specific to your family, that changes the legal exposure considerably, both for Madison and for her. Within 3 days, Fatima's research team returned with findings that reframed the entire situation. Kayla had, in fact, been involved in at least 2 previous instances where young women in her orbit had posted similarly structured, emotionally dramatic videos accusing family members of abuse, each time coinciding with a crowdfunding campaign benefiting both the accuser and, through a formal business partnership disclosed in the fine print of her website, Kayla herself, who took a documented percentage of all funds raised through campaigns she helped produce and promote. This isn't just Madison acting alone out of genuine, if misdirected, pain, Fatima explained, spreading printed screenshots across her desk. This appears to be a repeatable business model, one Kayla has quietly run at least twice before, each time targeting vulnerable young people facing financial hardship, encouraging them to reframe difficult but ordinary family relationships into dramatic abuse narratives for profit. I felt something shift inside me at that information, a complicated mixture of anger and a strange, aching grief for Madison, who I still believed, somewhere beneath everything, had been genuinely manipulated into this, rather than acting purely out of calculated cruelty. What happens next? I asked. Fatima leaned back in her chair. We have several options. We could pursue a defamation claim immediately, which would be strong given your documentation. But Rachel, I think there's a more strategic approach available here, one that protects your reputation just as effectively while giving Madison a path to understand what she's actually been drawn into, rather than simply escalating this into a courtroom battle against your own stepdaughter. She explained her plan carefully. Madison, it turned out, had scheduled a follow-up live-stream interview for the following week with a moderately popular podcast focused on survivor stories, an opportunity Kayla had apparently arranged to further amplify the fundraiser before public attention inevitably moved elsewhere. Fatima had already identified a contact on the podcast's production team, someone with enough journalistic integrity to understand the seriousness of what verified documentation might reveal, if presented at exactly the right moment. If we can arrange for you to appear on that same broadcast, Fatima said, with Dr. Nwusu's professional statement and your documented records in hand, we're not simply defending you after the fact. We're ensuring the full truth reaches the same audience Madison and Kayla worked so hard to build. I thought of Madison at 14, quietly crying in my car after a difficult call with her mother, thanking me softly for staying exactly as long as she needed me to. I thought of the version of her currently profiting from erasing that memory entirely. Set it up, I said quietly. It's time Madison understood exactly what she agreed to be part of. Fatima insisted we approach the following week with the same careful discipline she applied to every case she'd ever handled. We don't reach out to Madison directly before the broadcast, she told me during our second meeting. If she or Kayla suspects anything is coming, they'll cancel the interview, restructure the narrative, maybe even accelerate the fundraiser's closing date before we ever get a chance to present verified documentation to the same audience they've built. Right now, they believe this story is running exactly according to plan. That's the only advantage working in our favor. It took everything in me not to call Madison directly, to beg her to remember the truth of our relationship before this went any further. Every protective instinct I had built over 12 years of raising her told me to intervene immediately, to interrupt whatever process had led her to this point before more damage accumulated. But the same careful patience that had guided me through years of gently earning her trust told me Fatima was right. Confronting her privately now would simply give Kayla room to help her construct an even more polished defense before the broadcast. Continue exactly as you have been, Fatima said. Stay silent publicly. Let Madison and Kayla believe the fundraiser narrative are proceeding without any real threat to their credibility. She slid a folder across her desk containing Dr. Nwusu's formal professional statement, my organized journal entries spanning 6 years, and a summary of Fatima's research team's findings regarding Kayla's previous campaigns. We're not going into that interview to attack Madison publicly. We're going in to ensure the full, documented truth reaches exactly the people who were shown only half of it. That same week, Dr. Nwusu reached out again, this time with an unexpected addition to her original offer. She had, with appropriate professional and ethical consideration, reviewed her clinical notes once more and identified a specific detail she felt was significant enough to include in any formal statement. During one of their sessions when Madison was 15, Madison had explicitly and unprompted described me, in Dr. Nwusu's own documented words, as the only adult in my life who's never once made me feel like I had to earn being loved. I don't say this lightly, Rachel, Dr. Nwusu told me during our call, but I believe this detail, documented contemporaneously years before any of this financial pressure existed, directly and substantively contradicts the current narrative. I'm prepared to include it in my formal statement, if you believe it would help. Fatima, when I relayed the conversation, allowed herself a rare, measured smile. That's more powerful than anything we could have constructed ourselves, she said. A licensed professional's contemporaneous clinical documentation, created years before financial motive existed, directly quoting Madison's own words. Rachel, we're not simply walking into that broadcast with a defense anymore. We're walking in with Madison's own past voice, unaltered and unaware of what it would eventually need to protect against. The morning of the scheduled broadcast arrived with a strange, deliberate stillness. I sat in Fatima's office reviewing the documentation one final time, feeling less like a woman preparing for confrontation and more like someone finally preparing to hand a lost young woman back a version of her own history she had allowed herself to forget. We're not there to humiliate Madison, Fatima reminded me gently as we gathered our materials. We're there to make sure the truth simply becomes impossible for anyone, including Madison herself, to keep ignoring. The podcast studio occupied a converted loft space downtown, cameras and microphones arranged carefully around a small circular table, designed to feel intimate despite the thousands of viewers expected to watch the live stream. Fatima had arranged, through her production contact, for me to be seated in a small adjacent room, technically listed on the day's schedule as a verification segment guest, a deliberately vague description that gave nothing away to Madison or Kayla, who arrived separately 20 minutes before the broadcast began. Through a monitor in the adjacent room, I watched Madison settle into her seat across from the host, dressed carefully in soft, unassuming colors clearly chosen to reinforce the vulnerability of her story. Kayla sat just off camera, close enough to offer supportive glances whenever Madison's voice wavered, the same practiced choreography I now recognized as deliberate rather than spontaneous. The host opened warmly, guiding Madison through a now familiar retelling of her childhood, the isolation, the control, the years of feeling unworthy of love in her own home. Madison's voice trembled at exactly the same moments it had in the original video, and I felt a complicated ache watching her perform pain I knew, somewhere underneath the performance, wasn't entirely manufactured, even if the specific memories attached to it had been reshaped into something unrecognizable. At the 30-minute mark, exactly as Fatima had arranged, the host turned toward the camera with practiced smoothness. "Before we continue, we have someone joining remotely who I think adds an important layer of context to this conversation. Dr. Patricia Nwusu is a licensed child psychologist who worked directly with Madison's family several years ago." Madison's expression shifted instantly, confusion and alarm flickering across her face as Dr. Nwusu's video feed appeared on screen. "I wasn't told anyone else was joining today," Madison said quietly, glancing toward Kayla, who had gone visibly still off camera. Dr. Nwusu spoke calmly and carefully, exactly as she had prepared. "I want to be respectful of Madison's privacy and her right to share her own experiences," she began. "But given the specific and serious public claims being made, I feel a professional obligation to note that nothing in my contemporaneous clinical documentation from the year I worked with this family supports the pattern of abuse currently being described." She paused. "In fact, my notes from a session when Madison was 15 include a direct quote from Madison herself, describing her stepmother as, in her words, the only adult in my life who's never once made me feel like I had to earn being loved." The studio fell into stunned silence. Madison's face had gone pale, her earlier composed vulnerability cracking into something rawer and more uncertain. I don't remember saying that," she said quietly, though her voice carried none of its earlier, practiced conviction. Fatima, watching from beside me in the adjacent room, gave a small, deliberate nod toward the production assistant standing by the door. It was time. I walked into the studio quietly, feeling every camera shift toward me the moment I entered. Madison's eyes widened, her hand rising instinctively to her mouth as recognition and panic crossed her face simultaneously. "Rachel," she whispered, barely audible even through the microphone clipped to her collar. I took the empty seat Fatima had arranged beside Dr. Nwusu's monitor, folding my hands calmly in my lap, meeting Madison's eyes for the first time since the video had appeared 11 days earlier. "Hello, Madison," I said quietly. "I think it's time we talked about page 14 of my journal from the year you turned 15, and about a woman named Kayla, and about exactly how much of what you've raised money from these last few days was actually your own story to tell." Madison sat frozen across from me, the color drained entirely from her face, while the host glanced between us with the sharpened alertness of someone realizing their broadcast had shifted into something far more consequential than planned. Kayla, still positioned just off camera, had gone rigid, her earlier supportive expression replaced by something colder and more calculating. "Rachel, I don't understand what's happening right now," Madison said, her voice small in a way that reminded me painfully of the frightened 14-year-old I had once comforted after difficult phone calls with her mother. "I think you understand more than you're letting yourself admit," I said gently, opening the folder Fatima had prepared, careful to keep my tone steady rather than accusatory. "I kept a journal for years, Madison. Not because I ever expected to need it as evidence, but because it was simply how I processed being your stepmother, especially during difficult stretches after your mom's visits left you unsettled. I turned to a marked page. This is from the week after your 15th birthday, the same week Dr. Nwusu just quoted from her own notes. I wrote about how proud I was of you for opening up in therapy, and how you told me afterward that talking to Dr. Nwusu had helped you feel less alone. Madison's eyes filled with tears that looked, for the first time since the original video, entirely unrehearsed. I've been trying so hard to remember things the way Kayla helped me see them. She kept telling me that if things felt hard, that meant they probably were abuse, even if I didn't remember them that way at the time. The host, sensing the shift in the room, leaned forward carefully. Kayla, would you like to respond to what's being presented here? Kayla straightened, attempting to reclaim the composed authority she'd carried into the studio. I think it's important we don't discredit survivors simply because their stepmother shows up with cherry-picked journal entries, she said, though her voice carried a defensive edge that hadn't been there moments earlier. Fatima, who had quietly entered the studio behind me, stepped forward with a second folder. I'd also like to address a pattern our research team identified over the past week, she said, her voice calm but carrying clearly across the studio. Kayla, you've been involved in at least 2 previous campaigns with a strikingly similar structure. A young person publicly accusing a family member of abuse, paired with a crowdfunding campaign from which you retain a documented percentage, disclosed only in the fine print of your business website. Kayla's composure finally cracked visibly. That's a completely different context. Is it? Fatima asked, sliding printed screenshots across the table toward the host. Because in both previous cases, the accused family members later provided documentation similarly contradicting the specific claims made, though by then, the damage to their reputations and the funds raised had already been finalized. Madison turned toward Kayla with an expression of dawning, horrified realization. You told me this would help me heal. You said sharing my story would give me control over my own narrative. Her voice cracked. Was any of this actually about healing, or was it always about the fundraiser? Kayla didn't answer. She simply reached for her bag, murmuring something about needing air, before standing and walking quickly out of frame, leaving the studio in a stunned, uncertain silence. The studio remained silent for a long moment after Kayla disappeared from frame, the host clearly unsure how to steer a broadcast that had veered so far from its planned trajectory. Madison sat, her hands pressed against her face, her earlier composed vulnerability now replaced by something far more raw and unguarded. I don't know what's true anymore, she said quietly, her voice muffled behind her palms. I spent months talking to her about this. She kept reframing things, small moments, until they didn't feel like my memories anymore. They felt like evidence. Dr. Nwusu's voice came gently through the monitor. Madison, I want to be clear that I'm not questioning whether you experienced real pain during those years. Grief over your mother's absence, the difficulty of blending families, ordinary adolescent struggles, those were all real and valid and part of what we discussed in our sessions together. What concerns me is how those genuine, ordinary difficulties appear to have been deliberately reframed into something they were never clinically documented to be. I reached across the table, not to grab Madison's hand, but simply to rest mine near hers, close enough to offer comfort without pressing it on her. Madison, I'm not here to punish you, I said. I'm here because I spent 12 years showing up for you, and I'm not willing to let that disappear because someone convinced you it was profitable to rewrite it. The host, regaining some composure, turned toward the camera. I think given what's unfolded in the last several minutes, it's important we pause this conversation and allow Madison time to process everything that's been presented today, rather than continuing under the original format. Madison nodded slowly, wiping at her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. "I need to see the fundraiser taken down," she said, her voice steadier now, though still fragile. "Today, I need to issue a correction. I don't want money that came from a story that wasn't fully true." Fatima nodded approvingly beside me. "We can help you draft an appropriate correction statement, if you're willing, one that acknowledges the genuine difficulties you experienced, without the specific fabricated claims that caused real reputational harm to Rachel." 3 days later, Gary called me for the first time since asking me to stay elsewhere until things calmed down. His voice was hollow, exhausted, carrying none of the flat accusation from that first terrible night. "I saw the broadcast," he said. "I saw the journal entries. Rachel, I should have asked you directly before I ever believed a video over 12 years of actually living beside you." I listened to him carefully, feeling neither immediate forgiveness nor lingering rage, simply a tired, complicated recognition of everything that had unfolded. "You didn't just believe a stranger, Gary," I said quietly. "You believed our daughter over me, without a single question, the moment it became publicly convenient to." He didn't argue. He simply apologized again, quieter this time, and asked if there was any way to begin rebuilding what the last 2 weeks had broken. I didn't have an answer for him yet, but for the first time since the video appeared, I finally had my own voice back in the story, no longer buried beneath someone else's carefully constructed version of who I had always been. Madison took down the fundraiser within hours of the broadcast, issuing a public correction that acknowledged the genuine grief and confusion she had carried for years, while explicitly retracting the specific claims of sustained abuse, along with the $11,000 raised, which she personally returned to every donor over the following month, insisting on repaying it in full despite Fatima's advice that legally she wasn't obligated to. Kayla's business unraveled far faster than any of us anticipated. Within a week, journalists who had picked up the story of the broadcast began investigating her previous campaigns, uncovering the same pattern Fatima's research team had identified. 2 of her former clients, young people she had similarly encouraged toward dramatized abuse narratives years earlier, came forward publicly with their own accounts of manipulation, describing almost identical language and tactics to what Madison had experienced. Kayla's online following collapsed within a month, her sponsorship deals quietly cancelled one after another. Gary and I entered couples counselling 3 weeks after the broadcast, a slow, uncomfortable process of rebuilding trust that neither of us pretended would be simple. He struggled, in those early sessions, to fully articulate why he had believed a stranger's viral video over 12 years of daily evidence, eventually admitting, painfully, that some deeply buried resentment about feeling like a secondary parent in Madison's emotional life had made him vulnerable to a narrative that, however false, momentarily validated that old insecurity. Madison and I rebuilt our relationship slowly, carefully, through a process closer to the patient trust-building of her early adolescence than anything resembling a quick reconciliation. We began meeting for coffee every other week, conversations that started stilted and uncertain before gradually finding their way back towards something resembling our old ease. She started her own therapy, separate from any family sessions, working specifically with a psychologist experienced in identifying manipulation and coercive influence, determined, she told me, to understand exactly how she had been guided toward rewriting her own history so completely. Dr. Nwusu's professional statement became unexpectedly part of a broader conversation within her field about the ethics of online healing influencers who profited from encouraging young people to reframe ordinary family difficulty as documented abuse. She was invited to speak at 2 professional conferences about the case, anonymized appropriately, using it as a cautionary example for other clinicians about the intersection of social media incentives and genuine therapeutic harm. I returned to my own work as a school psychologist within a month, though the experience changed, in subtle but permanent ways. How I approached conversations with the students and families I worked with, carrying a deeper understanding of how easily a genuine, complicated pain could be reshaped into something simpler, more marketable, and ultimately more damaging than the truth it replaced. I think about that first night often, watching Gary's face as he scrolled through comments from strangers who had already decided, within hours, exactly who I was. What I understand now, in a way I couldn't have during that first terrible week, is that the truth doesn't need to shout as loudly as the lie that tries to bury it. It simply needs enough patience and enough documentation to eventually be heard. 2 years have passed since I sat in that podcast studio, opening a worn journal to a page I never imagined I would need to defend 12 years of quiet, patient love. Madison and I now speak every week, sometimes about ordinary things, sometimes still working carefully through the harder conversations neither of us fully finished during those difficult months of rebuilding. She calls me Rachel still, the same first name she's used since she was 10 years old, though these days it carries a warmth I don't think either of us takes for granted anymore. Gary and I remain together, though our marriage looks different now than it did before that first terrible night. We are both more careful, more intentional, more willing to ask difficult questions directly rather than allowing assumptions to quietly calcify into resentment. Some days, that carefulness still feels like grief for the easier trust we once had. Most days, it feels like something sturdier, built more honestly than what came before it. Kayla eventually relocated to a different city, according to a former colleague who occasionally sends updates, attempting to rebuild a smaller, quieter version of her online presence, though the specific niche she once specialized in never fully recovered its previous credibility. I don't think about her often, though when I do, it's with a strange, complicated pity rather than lingering anger, understanding now how many other young people like Madison she likely guided toward the same painful reframing of ordinary struggle into marketable trauma. Dr. Nwuzu and I remain in touch, occasionally collaborating on training sessions for other clinicians about recognizing manipulation in family dynamics amplified by social media incentives. My sister Elena still teases me sometimes about the exact moment my hands finally stopped shaking during that broadcast, insisting she watched the shift happen in real time on the studio monitor. Fatima's firm represented 2 other families over the following year in strikingly similar cases she later told me she likely wouldn't have recognized as connected without the pattern our situation first helped surface. I think about that sometimes, the strange, unplanned usefulness of simply having kept careful, honest records for reasons that had nothing to do with ever needing to defend myself. I think about that first night far less often now than I once did, and when I do, it arrives with something closer to quiet gratitude than lingering pain. Raising a child who isn't biologically yours teaches you, eventually, that love built through patience rather than blood is no less real, no less permanent, and no less deserving of being believed when it matters most. I am not the woman that video once tried to make 500,000 strangers believe I was. I never was. I was simply someone who loved a frightened, grieving little girl patiently enough to still be standing there, 12 years later, when the truth finally needed defending. If you've ever had your love for someone twisted into something unrecognizable by people who never truly knew your relationship, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if this journey meant something to you, don't forget to like and subscribe. There are more stories like this one.